Cadenced Abuse. This is a Busybody podcast, and I'm so excited to be here with Cecile Simmons. Am I saying your name right?
Yes.
Welcome. Can you tell us, just give us your rundown? What are you doing these days?
So I actually have a bit of a difficult job, I guess. So I work for a think tank that focuses on kind of radicalization, extremism, and basically all the weird stuff that's happening on the internet. And I got into that about 8 years ago. And my job really kicked off during the pandemic, as you can imagine. Um, and at that point, I was kind of looking at anti-vax content online. I was also training to be a yoga teacher, and I kind of realized that early on in the pandemic, during the first lockdown, essentially, I kind of realized that health, mis and disinformation in the wellness space was something that for me was going to get really big. And I saw it really early on when some of the people I was following were sharing kind of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. And some of my mentors, some of my teachers. And I think that since then, I've kind of followed a range of, I guess, conspiracy theories online. I followed kind of health misinformation online as well. And I really see kind of my interest is in kind of mapping how political kind of ideologies and wellness content intersects. And I think that so much of what we're talking about today has some kind of relevance to wellness. And I think that we live in quite a confused world where we actually don't really know what wellness is anymore. We don't really know what having a healthy diet is anymore, which sounds really, I suppose, paradoxical in the sense that you have so much medical guideline that's really clear about what a healthy diet is, but because we're constantly bombarded with content online, it gets really difficult to know what kind of health and well-being is. And I find that increasingly wellness content is political, and I'm really interested in how we can have wellness in a way that is actually equitable, in a way that kind of still works with kind of evidence-based medicine, how we can be kind of gentle with ourselves, because I think the wellness world has kind of shifted to the right massively and is increasingly being weaponized by all sorts of groups. So I actually I do a lot of things, but I'm the author of a book that's just come out, and it's called Control, Hate, Delete. And it's a book that focuses on the kind of current anti-feminist backlash, whether it's trad wife content, whether it's the Manosphere content, whether it's, attacks on reproductive rights. And through all those themes, as I was writing the book, the kind of key thread through all of that was the kind of return to a form of kind of like body fascism and this really rigid wellness kind of content that's a way to suck people into kind of darker ideologies. I'm not saying that wellness is right wing by definition, but I see increasingly, essentially, like really sometimes quite extremist groups use the body, use wellness, use, essentially, like, yes, kind of weaponize people's concerns about their health and their bodies to essentially push quite rigid gender norms and, quite narrow visions of what an ideal body should be.
Wow. This is my jam. I have so many things to say. Um, um, Before we start, I thought I was looking through some things that you've written, and can you define for us the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Yes. The thing about disinformation, though, is that I think it's increasingly, it's a word that I've just used, but I also think it's a word that isn't that useful. Similarly with misinformation. So I think the way we define disinformation is essentially kind of misleading information that is spread deliberately,
Intention.
whereas
Yeah.
misinformation would kind of be something that is equally misleading, but that might be, I suppose, spread unintentionally. And the problem is that we don't, because so many people are sharing so many things, it's kind of impossible to determine intent in so many things. But what I find fascinating about today's online world is that increasingly people don't use disinformation anymore or misinformation. Um, the way current kind of regressive ideologies work is by using kind of selective information, or making some
Mm.
truths more obvious than others, or using cherry picking data, or using kind of not really robust studies to make their points. So it's essentially, I don't think everything that people share is disinformation, but put together, it just creates a completely distorted picture. So whether it's, kind of climate denial, kind of anti-climate content, whether it's, the Manosphere talking to men, quite often what people say is true. They might be using real examples, or they might even be making points that are real, but they are making very selective points to paint a particular picture. And so when we think of health and wellness, so much of the health misinformation we see is kind of based on a kernel of truth, or studies that might be accurate, or that might have something to them, but then it is used to, well, depends what it's used for, but quite often it's used for either a commercial or a political agenda. Quite often in the world of wellness, it's used to sell you all sorts of things, whether it's supplements, whether it's um I don't know, infrared
It
saunas, or whatever it is that people are trying to sell you. But people don't necessarily need to lie anymore.
That's fascinating. Um, it's kind of like the whole Huberman podcast
Yep.
thing. It's all cherry picked and yeah, obviously for huge financial gain. Um, and even you're making me think about all the kind of talk around cold plunging,
Yes.
and that is a space that or kind of a conversation that's interesting to me, and I've even gotten in a few like Instagram tiffs over, because I cold swim in the winter with a group of people once a week in a very relaxed, very chill way where no one is counting, no one is doing special breathing. We just gather basically to be outside in the winter and do this kind of wild, crazy thing. And it feels very fun and freeing. And no one is like hoping that it's giving us, immortal abilities. And then I've seen, obviously there's so many people out there saying how cold plunging is going to solve every single problem that you've ever had. And then I've also seen this kind of backlash of some of the people that I follow that normally I find their content, balanced and useful. Some of them are doctors that specifically work with women and women's bodies and health, saying, "Oh, cold plunging is really bad for the women's, for your fertility and for your menstrual cycle and all that stuff." And that was one that I got in an argument with because I was like, first of all, if you're sitting in a frozen, garbage can every day for 20 minutes, like people show themselves on Instagram, then that seems silly. And if you
Yeah.
look at like we don't need a scientific study to say that's probably not a great idea for you. Um, but if you look at where kind of cold swimming and wild swimming comes from, Northern European countries, it's a long-standing tradition, and it usually is done mainly by women. I mean, not always, but like it's a very female tradition in a lot of ways. And I don't think everybody in Finland is having menstrual difficulties, and it's like the intention behind it and what you're doing, and not these like yo-yos in California who are like sitting in literally just a garbage can full of ice. That's a very different experience than being in Scandinavia and running into a cold lake and then coming back into a sauna or something like that, and probably drinking vodka at the same time.
Yeah. Um, I guess so. I'm a fellow cold plunger, so I live by the sea in England, and I do swim all year round. Also with actually a local group of women
Mm.
across ages, and there's a lovely sort of communal feeling about it. Um, what I find really lovely about that group is that there is, in particular, no judgment about kind of body shapes, how young people should be, how slim they should be, or essentially all of the things that you see as soon as your Instagram feed kind of understands that you're into wellness, and then
Exactly.
you see people in the kind of cold kind of tubs and things. I think that I'm someone who I think really loves quite simple things like sort of walking in nature. I do love swimming in the sea. I think a lot of things now. What my beef with wellness is that in some ways, it's ruined things that I think
Mhm. Mhm.
are just special on their own and that don't need to have huge health benefits to just be quite nice. Although I suspect that actually cold plunges for me have had a benefit. If I'm honest, I think that actually cold plunges have helped me get through some of the research I'm doing online in a way. Do you know, it kind of
Of course, yeah.
disconnects me from that. But I also find that everything today is, in a way, if you're into wellness and if you've really gone down that rabbit hole of wellness, you start to think of everything as a wellness trend or something that's good for you. And it really sucks the meaning of things that, you know, might actually not be about health at all. I'm thinking in my case, so my mother was born in Poland and I've got Eastern European kind of ancestry. And so things like fermented foods and sauerkraut,
Mhm.
they're part
Mhm.
of my culture. And interestingly, now that all these fermented foods are kind of everywhere, I now think of it as something that is about health, whereas actually it's the flavor of my childhood. And I
Mm.
think that's really a reflection of being on the internet and thinking of everything as a cure all, or something that is supposed to kind of support your health, or something that will either make you immortal or essentially kill you. And I think that wellness is a rabbit hole. It's a rabbit hole, and I can see that having really gone down that rabbit hole during the pandemic and still being a little bit in that rabbit hole to a certain extent. I mean, really taking a big step back from it, it really changes your relationship to everything. You just don't do a walk anymore without thinking, oh, this is a healthy thing that I'm doing. Or it's quite hard to disconnect from that mindset. And it's essentially quite a, maybe that's too big a word, but kind of, you know, I think it's a mindset that is kind of strongly focused on optimizing yourself. And I'm very critical of that, but I also recognize that I have that mindset. And it's
Sure.
the, after all, it's the mindset that we've been encouraged by kind of our societies to cultivate. So it's not even that I'm that different from the values that kind of society is
No,
kind of.
not at all. And I think also as we increasingly have less and less community, we have this focus always to solve our own problems and to control our own lives. And as we become more isolated, which is also part of the manosphere, which we'll talk about, we don't look to other people to help us, and we are constantly fed this message that, like, if only I ate better, slept more, perfectly, then all of my problems would go away. It's not that I should ask a friend to help me do XYZ, um, or just see people and chill for a minute and not self-obsess about, every single thing that I'm eating and doing. And especially with all the trackers and all this stuff, I mean, I feel like every single person I see has one of those Aura rings on, which in itself almost feels a little bit, like a Black Mirror episode or something. Everybody's tracking themselves all the time.
Well,
Um, and I know that all these things, I think this is where wellness is so interesting, and it's also tricky because I know that also all these things have helped people and probably helped you and have helped me at times. I've tracked things just to get a sense of what's going on and this and that, and it can all be helpful until it becomes a rabbit hole. And just as you said, it's often that what people are saying is true. Like, it probably is. I mean, it, it is good to go for a walk, right? Do people need to get a certain number of steps every day? I don't know. And now you have all these people that are like obsessed with getting steps and going on walks because they haven't hit their steps yet today, and losing just that, like, maybe just going for a 10-minute walk when you have time is better than now obsessively trying to get in your 23-minute walk that gets you just the perfect amount of steps or something.
yeah, absolutely. I think I'm I think it's probably influenced by the work that I do, but I'm someone who actively resists tracking. So I
Same.
do have a Garmin watch, but I mean, apart from my occasional run, I actually almost don't track anything, and I actively resist tracking in the same way as, to a certain extent, I actually resist social media a little bit. I have an Instagram page that's open. I don't use Facebook. I don't use X anymore. In some ways, I do social media. I think it's because I've done social media. I've done social media for work so much. I don't actually do social media personally that
Mhm,
much
mhm.
anymore.
I mean, same, same. I mean, I have and this is where some of the things that you've written about were is particularly interesting to me because I am in some ways a wellness influencer. I'm not really an influencer because from my understanding, a real influencer, their entire brand is essentially about be like me, and it's very personal and there's a lot of sharing about their personal lives so that you
Yeah.
can really create this whole aspirational world and environment. I have a brand and a business and I want you to come and move into, become part of my business and that community. But I don't share imagery and story about my personal health and my personal wellness. I don't share I do this thing where I post my breakfast uh when I remember to, only because I know so many people don't eat regularly. So it's just my way of saying like, let's all eat breakfast together, but I definitely never post, like, a bunch of meals or, like, this is my protein-packed lunch or, like, anything like that. But it was interesting reading some of your things. One of the ways that it seems that you delineate when something is, probably, um, harmful is if there's financial gain on some side or, like, a promise, and I was like, "Oh, that's tricky," because 'cause that's also I mean, that's why I have an Instagram account, essentially, hopefully people buy from me. Um, I think obviously you're
Yeah.
talking about manipulation and promises, um, but it is interesting because it's like, where does the scale tip? Um,
I mean, the reality is, if you have a yoga studio, if you're a fitness instructor, you have a business, and there's nothing wrong with, monetizing yoga content or meditation courses. I mean, there's nothing wrong with monetizing an awful lot of things. I think that in kind of today's world of kind of more like nutritional mis and disinformation, I feel that a lot of people, you mentioned Andrew Huberman, you mentioned, like, in the UK, we also have, kind of for profit organizations and influencers who are doing really well with nutritional content and health content. Um, you know, um, Something like the Diary of a CEO podcast in the UK, the kind of Zoe app. They're essentially kind of for profit kind of enterprises that, I mean, I suppose, um, kind of monetize things like, I don't know, well, they have partnerships with, kind of
right, I mean
brands, and they also kind of monetize things like glucose monitoring, right?
right.
Things
I mean,
that,
this is the cherry picking. This is the like taking a little kernel of something that's true. If somebody has wildly unmanaged glucose, that's not healthy, but everybody's glucose spikes after they eat, but we can make them seem like your glucose should supposedly never spike, which is not true, but that's a great way to easily frighten people and get them all hooked on a whole thing.
yeah. And what I find really interesting is that, I have found, and I don't know if that's perhaps a reflection of my own disengagement with the most extreme wellness kind of fads and content, is that we're seeing more kind of nutritionists and people with kind of proper kind of nutritional qualification get massive kind of reach online with much more kind of balanced kind of cooking related content. Like someone like Emily English in the UK, she's one of the most kind of popular kind of food influencers, and she's a nutritionist. So, you know, kind of she does recipes that are essentially kind of recommended by a nutritionist.
Mm,
I think that I also find that there are so many excellent, wellness educators. So people who have training in fitness, you know, well, fitness or, yoga or something else. And they're very good at, I think, essentially doing what they're doing, but in an inclusive way, in a way that doesn't, kind of encourage, I suppose, kind of extreme forms of exercise or body shaming. And I find and people who kind of really deconstruct the kind of roots of a specific obsession with wellness that we have and a specific obsession about looking a certain way are doing a really an amazing job. And they may have things to sell. They, they after all, we all have jobs to do and work to do. So it's not that I have problems with monetization. It's just that I'm thinking of these people who have built huge podcasts where they're inviting, kind of anti-vaccine
Right.
doctors and, contrarian cardiologists who tell you that you can eat as much red meat as you like and be absolutely fine, and who just go against every kind of medical recommendation. But yeah.
Um, w- you one of the things I was reading, you were saying that let me literally look at my notes, that we're in an age of kind of permanent crisis, and earlier you were saying we now, like, nobody knows what a healthy diet is anymore, even though conceivably you could literally just Google, like, what is a balanced diet?
Mm.
You'd probably get like a pretty good recommendation, like a pretty general. There would also be like 1,000 other things that are very extreme. Um, what do you feel like there's a specific moment when that started to happen? Is it like the 24-hour news cycle era, or like when did we get into this place where people have become so detached from just kind of the basics? Because this is something I'm always saying to my clients, like it's not that hard. Like just like go outside, drink water, try and eat balanced meals regularly, like see people, sleep. Like it like just
Yeah.
it's not so complicated, but then just as you have written about and experienced yourself, I know so many people, most specifically women who are going through perimenopause and menopause. So obviously, there's a whole aspect here of just Western healthcare failing women in particular, who are doing the kind of oh, my naturopath told me I'm allergic to pumpkin seeds and
Yeah.
yogurt, and you're like, okay, and then they're like. So now they're on this bizarro restrictive diet. This just happened to me recently that I was like visiting some people and I looked around the room and I was like, "Oh my god, like every woman here is on some weirdo, super restrictive diet that they're all saying is for their health, code name health slash they're all losing weight because they can't eat anything." But
Mhm.
it's all like no one can comment on the fact that they've lost weight because they're not really on a diet. "Oh, oops, I didn't mean to lose all this weight. It's just because 'cause I'm allergic to so many things." And I just was looking around the room like, this is this weirdo Ozempic age, like, yeah,
Mm,
misinformation, everyone like big pharma slash turn away from all medical care kind of
yeah.
extremes. Um,
Yeah. So I think that obviously diet culture is very old, and there have been, fears about carbs for decades, over
yeah.
half a century. I mean, even more actually. If you kind of listen to some of the experts who are looking back kind of millennia, they're like, back, in thousands of years, before Christ, there were just still people saying that, grain will kill you. But I think that in terms of the actual exposure to absolutely crazy diets, kind of in terms of, because my interest is really on the kind of online influence. And I really think that the turning point for crazy online influence when it comes to food is really the pandemic.
Mm, mm,
Basically, when so many people turn to content creation, so many people, obviously, I think we live with the legacy of the pandemic, which is not trusting doctors. I think many of us don't trust doctors because I think it's quite hard. It's not that we don't trust doctors necessarily, but as someone who struggles with a chronic condition, and as someone who has struggled with eating disorders, I think you can trust your doctor, but I think you can also feel intuitively that, and that's kind of my feeling, is that we're not very well. And I think that so many of these, essentially scammers, they will tell you that. They will tell you that we live in incredibly unhealthy societies, which I agree with. It's just that they have a very narrow definition of what unhealthy means. And, they will point to things like ultra processed food. They will point to things like sitting for hours at your laptop. They will not always talk about community. They will not always talk about environmental pollution. They will almost never talk about any of it, or they will talk about it and then they will encourage you to optimize your way out of it. So they
And
will
they
tell you
certainly don't talk about
negative.
class differences and education
Oh,
differences and
yes.
access and all that stuff.
But I think they really tap into something, into that feeling that many of us have, that indeed kind of our health is quite crap quite a lot of the time. And I have so many friends suffering from kind of chronic health conditions. And then when you do that, you end up going to all sorts of kind of alternative health providers and you end up trying so many restricted diets. I did that for 2 years. I went on a crazy amount of sort of diets and trying to treat I've got a health, like, skin condition. I tried to sort of treat it without steroids, and it was incredibly kind of destructive because I tried so many things, and basically I went online as well. And if you listen to voices online, essentially you can eat anything because one person will tell you that
Right.
this is really bad for you, and another person will tell you that this is very bad for you. I also think that in the middle of this, you have quite, well, I don't know. I think you have really contradictory, I suppose, diets that kind of go against each other. And again, there are endless rabbit holes when it comes to nutrition. So, on the one hand, you've got sort of veganism, which, by the way, from an ethical point of view, I agree is, the best diet. But, you've got quite often a sort of vegan rabbit hole where, if you eat any animal product, you're essentially doomed to cancer. And then you've got sort of the carnivore diet, which is insane. And I think that we kind of live with a lot of kind of competing restrictive diets online and endless kind of nutritional kind of rabbit holes to go down. Um, and that kind of influence for me is quite recent. I mean, something like the carnivore diet, it's really quite recent. Like, no one
Yeah.
was talking about something like the carnivore diet. I think it's really the result of how extreme the internet has become and how actually kind of political things have become as well. If you look at carnival content, it's incredibly, like, the nature of that is kind of incredibly kind of political. It's really, there is no, for me, that kind of the intersection between the carnivore diet and kind of right wing content is so clear. I'm not saying that every carnivore influencer is some sort of, far right influencer, but it's quite clear that there's absolutely kind of no consideration about the ethics, the environmental impact of that sort of diet. And it's also quite clear that it's a diet that is designed for those who follow it to kind of optimize yourself,
Hmm.
regardless of kind of joy, community,
Hmm.
ethics, or anything else. It's a diet for kind of optimized individuals and who don't care what impact they're having on the
Hmm.
planet,
Hmm.
And it's so interesting that so many of the sort of so-called manosphere figures are kind of praising this sort of diet, whether it's Jordan Peterson, whether it's, even kind of Joe Rogan was saying he was kind of feeling great on that sort of diet, or, Andrew Tate and all these people, because yeah, I think there is kind of meaning behind it. I mean, maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole here and talking about this, but yeah.
I think it's definitely different from like the Atkins era, which seems
Yes.
to be kind of a backlash or a response to maybe kind of like 80s excess and blah blah blah, and also a lot of false science that got promoted at that time. So then we all went on the like low fat, high sugar thing, and then Atkins kind of came in and then hilariously died of a heart attack. But
Mm.
but the carnivore diet is different because it's billed not just as like a health thing or a weight loss thing, um, but as like a lifestyle and this like
Mm.
return to nature and
Yeah.
simplicity and like a self-sufficiency. I think that's something I always keep my ears pricked up for. Whatever the latest fad is, this kind of like I can be like the lone warrior against the zombie pack or something like this.
Mm.
I'm gonna optimize myself to the point of like I alone will stand on the mountaintop with my like homemade spear. Um, and even for women, that that there's a call for us as well, that this is where the trad wife stuff comes in. Like
Mm,
I can create everything that I need in my own domestic world, and I
mm,
can quote unquote balance my hormones and like be youthful forever and all this stuff. And I don't need any support. And then like medication is seen as being weak, you know?
mm,
Um and that is all of that is so tricky and slippery because also Western medicine does fail us, and Western
mm,
medicine is based on racist, misogynistic tropes as well. I mean, it's like
mm,
built by white men for white men, not studied on women. And I think every single woman has had an experience of going to the doctor and being completely dismissed. I went down the same rabbit holes you did when I was a teenager. I basically had irritable bowel, which is I put in
mm,
quotations because it's a issue that primarily affects women, usually young women, and no one knows why it happens. There's like not it's not inflammation, it's not really a pathology. You basically just have like a really unhappy gut system.
mm.
Um, Looking back, I can 100% track it to my father had just died, and almost a year to the month later, I like couldn't digest anything. Instead of being in therapy, that was before the internet, I literally was wandering around my little state in my little town, meeting with cuckoo people, you know, who were asking me, "Have you ever done this one where they, like, see if you're allergic to stuff by pushing on your limbs while they,
Yes,
like,
I've done
hold."
that as
Yeah,
well. I did that as well.
it seems so it's really easy to fall down on that one. It I don't know. You know, I did all that stuff. I went on all kinds of weird diets, and then like eventually just got older and more mature and saw really where that stuff was coming from, and like learned about anxiety and like, you know, working through feelings that I was having. But I was also being failed by people. I went to the doctor and they were like, "I don't know." I mean, like, literally, the guy was just like, "I don't really know. We could try this drug for you." And I was like, "But that's only part of the symptoms." And he was like, "I don't know what else to tell you."
Yeah.
And he didn't do good enough intake because American insurance systems and all stuff is so terrible. He could only spend 15 minutes with me. He didn't do a good enough intake to say what else is happening in her life, because if I had told him, he might have said, "Maybe you should seek mental health counseling instead." And
Yeah.
then, you know,
But you see, when we talk about the medical system failing women, I think that when I was telling you at the beginning that kind of wellness, kind of people's kind of discontent about kind of health is threaded through so many things happening today. One of the things that I find kind of fascinating today is the backlash against the pill,
mm,
the
mm,
contraceptive pill, because obviously we're kind of in a place where not just in the US but elsewhere there are kind of concerted efforts to diminish kind of reproductive rights, but also to limit, kind of basically get women off contraception in general
yeah,
in various ways and reduce their access to abortion. And I think that the pill is in a really interesting case because I think today, one, well, several segments of society have weaponized discontent with the pill. Obviously, you've got kind of Christian evangelicals who are kind of always against the pill by definition because they prefer kind of cycle tracking. But you also have the whole kind of wellness world that's really kind of cotton onto that. And, last year, the Washington Post reported that, more women are getting off the pill because of wellness, kind of essentially a fear mongering that's spreading online. But then I think that that fear mongering potentially works because it does have kind of a strong kernel of truth in the sense that
totally.
there are some links to kind of breast cancer with the pill, and I'm being someone who's slightly kind of wellness oriented. I've never taken the pill because I'm
Mhm.
quite wary of the pill. And of course, when the pill was first developed after World War II, it was tested on, kind of Puerto Rican women, and, it had massive side effects. And of course, when there was talk of developing, well, you know, when the first kind of the architects of the pill thought about doing a pill for men, they realized they had just too many side effects, so we're just not going to do it. And so it's
Mm,
when you kind of see Obviously, the pill has improved since. There are several generations of pills. But when you kind of look at the roots, the kind of darker, misogynistic, and racist roots of
Totally.
some of these kind of developments, it's just not that surprising that today you log into TikTok, you see some wellness influencer telling you that the pill is poison and that it's depleting your gut and sucking your minerals. And that's obviously all, kind of a bit wild. But that you kind of feel that, you know, um, like maybe it's just not that good for you. And I think that a lot of people, I think there is a move away from the pill that I think suits certain people. I think in the US, you have a lot of kind of pro kind of MAGA influencers who are really invested into this topic of the pill. But you also have more progressive people saying, I don't use the pill. I think, I had massive side effects. I just feel a lot better off it. But then the thing we're not talking about is then developing better things.
Exactly.
Because it's quite clear that this, right-wing Tradwife magazine is trying to sell you this cycle tracking app. And it's never really about equity. It's never really about improving access. Like once you've kind of criticized the medical profession or the pharmaceutical companies for, you know, developing these pills and they're not great and there are so many side effects. It's quite clear what the message is behind it. It's just, optimize yourself or track
Right.
your cycle. And it's not actually let's develop more equitable contraception, right? And I think that
Absolutely.
that issue is the same with everything, which is always optimize your way out of kind of collective problems and give up gluten and everything will be fine, whereas actually there are huge problems with kind of the food system, access, equity, affordability, so many issues. And it's never really about solving those issues.
You're listening to Busybody Podcast, sponsored by Brooklyn Strength, my studio. Brooklyn Strength is a virtual fitness and wellness studio offering weekly drop-in live virtual classes, monthly workshops, one-to-one private sessions with me or my teaching staff, as well as a whole host of self-paced coaching courses in strength, stability, injury prevention, as well as Nourish Yourself, my course where you can really deep dive with me to create daily habits around food and movement that are sustainable and not misogynistic, fatphobic, or racist. Challenging, but we do it. If you would like to support this podcast, you can support Brooklyn Strength by signing up for our classes or supporting me via Substack with a subscription. Hope you're enjoying this show. I don't know if you experienced this. Well, I have so many things to say about this. Quickly on the gluten, I don't know if you experienced this in the UK, but there's like a whole uh, thing in the US where people are like, "Oh, I'm allergic to gluten. I have celiacs," and then they go to Italy and they break down and they eat the pasta and they have no problems. And it's like a whole like people literally talk about it that it's like the Europe effect or something, but it's from what I understand, it's because literally the farming practices and the EU does a better job of regulating things, and also, like, there's just a cultural, um, care for farms, and certainly in France, like, almost every meal you eat is, like, local because they literally just value making sure that the food
Mm.
is, like, from picked today or harvested today or whatever, whereas in the US, our food systems are so depleted, it doesn't surprise me that people have reactions to eating like, old, stale, gross grain that was then like forced
Mm.
to whatever, rise and all this stuff. It's all chemically created bread. It's like not even really baked. It's very different from like a baguette that's still warm from the bakery that you just, that's like right by your house. Um, but the other thing about the pill, this is where very intelligent women with lots of resources fall down these rabbit holes because there's always this kernel of truth, and we're also always being failed just because women in general, our health is just not invested in and cared about, and we live in a culture that is still trying to control women in our bodies and essentially suppress us or oppress us. I was I was put on the pill when I was like 13 or something because I had terrible, terrible menstrual cramps that were so bad I would miss school. And they tried putting me on like humongous doses of acetaminophen, which thinking back on that is also just crazy. That's like so bad for your liver and your stomach. And those would make me so dopey that I still couldn't go to school. So here you have the classic issue, which happens in third world countries, especially where young women are literally losing education because of,
Ah,
physical issues. So I got put on the pill. It made the menstrual cramps go away. I literally was on the pill until I was like 30 something because no one ever questioned. And then, at that point, at some point in my life, I then was sexually active. So then I was like, why wouldn't I be on the pill? And I eventually got off of it because I started to realize that I was having like other things going on. It was almost like my own cycle was trying to like break through. And an herbalism teacher that I I did an herbalism program at one point, he just kind of casually pointed out that I had never had my own cycle in my entire fertile life because I
ah,
had been put on the pill so early, and that felt so heartbreaking, like all this time, no one had ever really given me that choice. No doctor had ever said, "Hey, looking at your
mm,
notes, you've been on this for 20 years. Like, is this the contraception you wanna be using?" Like, no one had even really discussed that with me, and I felt so kind of cheated, especially because the issue was a pain issue. It wasn't, I mean,
mm,
obviously it's tied to hormones, but I was like, "Why hasn't anyone just developed a specific pain reliever specific to menstrual cramps that I could take 3 days out of the month instead of something that I've been on all
yeah,
day, every month for my entire, essentially, like, my entire,
yeah,
life at that point?" But yeah, I think, like, no, when there's this vacuum of information, and then we have the complete opposite of a vacuum of information available to us at all times on the internet, of course you're going to start googling your symptoms and looking for someone who says, well, if only you just do this really rigid lifestyle. Oh, and
mm,
secretly you're going to also lose a bunch of weight and have, perfect abs. uh all these problems are gonna go away, and you just spent all these weeks going to doctors who are going, "Well, we could try this. I'm not sure if it's this," but someone else is like, "It's definitely this, and if you do this,
mm,
the problem will be solved." Why wouldn't you go that way, you know?
yeah. Um, shall I just go back to the gluten thing, or so
Yeah,
we
yeah,
let me
yeah, I
finish
know.
off?
There's a lot to talk
I find
about.
that really fascinating, all this content in the US that you see that's shared about, oh, I went to Italy and everyone's drinking wine and, having bread and they all look amazing. And in the US, you have half a slice of toast and
Yeah.
the bread that you will buy in a supermarket in the UK will be ultra processed. It will be full of kind of additives and gums and things. Whereas in France, where I'm from, I'm not saying the bread is amazing or that it's particularly high quality, but if you do go and buy a baguette, it will be flour, yeast, and water and salt, probably.
Mhm.
Like it won't be anything else. And so you can really see those differences across kind of countries and the kind of quality of the food and the affordability as well. Like the baguette in France is so affordable. It's such a staple. And so I think you can kind of idealize that as well. I think that Europe is really kind of gripped by this kind of gluten fear, but because now there's so much emphasis on ultra processed food and how ultra processed gluten-free breads are. There's now a return to
Right.
gluten in some ways. And I think that when you think of personal kind of rabbit holes, I certainly went through a gluten-free phase when I went through my phase of trying to sort out all my problems without medication. And I tried all sorts of things, and obviously gluten was one of the first things to go. Um, but then I'm back on gluten. I mean, I have been eating bread for you know, years now. I'm back on this and I'm actually doing really fine. And so it's quite interesting how we can really get sucked into very specific fears at very specific times with no evidence one way or the other. So obviously, many people are being tested for celiac disease. They test negative. They still feel that they're much better off without gluten. I think gets really personal, I guess. People feel what they feel. And in some ways I find what I find really interesting as well is that there are a couple of things that I don't eat because genuinely I've realized that intuitively I just feel better without it. And I think when intuitively, it's actually that intuition can also be weaponized by misinformation. So it's a really interesting one for me because you hear so much about, what's a good diet, what isn't a good diet, and then you kind of should trust your gut. But it's so difficult to trust your gut when
Exactly.
you're bombarded with so much misinformation, essentially, or so much, so many exaggerated claims. And when all your online feed is health and wellness, it's very difficult to kind of know what to do. And I have found that once I took a step back from essentially freaking out by kind of reading Instagram posts, that I could really step back and be like, really, is giving up gluten that useful to me?
Right.
Um, yeah, there are a few things that I'm kind of limiting, and it's working really well because once you're in a clearer state of mind, I think you can make those decisions. But when you're not at your best, or when you're kind of suffering from, I don't know, chronic disease flare up,
Yeah.
it's really easy to then kind of really be overwhelmed by that information, and by those competing claims. And it's very difficult then to actually trust your gut because you're like, yeah, obviously I feel much better without this or that food. And actually, months later, you eat those foods again and you're absolutely fine. So you couldn't really trust your gut in the first place. But I do think there is some merit to trusting your gut in some ways. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think there's two things that I often bring up to my clients when we talk about this subject, because this is like a constant. Um, One is everyone has had the experience of like uh being out at a restaurant or something and someone says later, "Oh, I think the fish was bad," or something. And then you're like, "Oh my god, I feel sick too," right? All you need is a suggestion. We can all do that. Like, or someone has been like, suddenly you obsess that like a little scrape is infected and then it starts hurting. Like your brain is really good at
Mm.
like tipping all the dominoes, and then your friend calls back and goes, "Oh, never mind. It wasn't the fish. Like my roommate is sick and now I got it." And then you're like, "Oh, I don't feel sick anymore." Like, so someone can really explain to you how gluten is going to poison you. And then every time you eat gluten, you're like, "That's true. I do feel poisoned." Like it's easy for us, especially if we're already not feeling well, for us to just our brains to kind of like capitalize on that and expand it. Um, and the I think, like, the danger of all of the overwhelm is, like, for sure it can happen at specific moments, like you pointed out, new motherhood, like, particular kind of periods when our defenses are really down, but also so many people, don't have any education, like, maybe they grew up in households where there just wasn't a lot of cooking, there's a lot of microwave meals, they just don't really have a lot of education around food, around their own, um tastes, what they like, and they might feel really kind of uncomfortable in that space anyway, and not really very connected to their bodies because maybe they just from their how they grew up, they weren't really ever encouraged to be more in tune with themselves, or they never did any kind of sport or activity that would help them feel what their bodies are actually feeling. So that also makes us so vulnerable. Um, and I think like that those combinations um make us very suggestible, and it becomes also in the absence of any other lifeline, is particularly when you are in a crisis or you're just kind of living in burnout, kind of chronic burnout. um Anything that kind of gives you the sense, almost like a placebo, that you're doing something for yourself is probably going to give you a feeling of benefit. You probably will say, "I feel better. I'm not eating gluten." And it's not because you're not eating gluten, it's because you're taking a step towards getting yourself out of this mire. And I remember, a million years ago, I listened to some interview that the celebrity trainer Jillian Michaels, who's very problematic, gave, but this little nugget that she said is very true. She was like, you see people saying, "I lost 40 pounds becoming vegan," or "I lost 40 pounds becoming carnivore, full meat," and everyone's like, "I don't understand which one is better." And she was like, "If you have never thought about what you eat before and you put any kind of intention into it, you probably are gonna see a difference." So it's
Mm.
not the diet that you did, it's just that for the first time in your life, you're going to the grocery store thinking, what do I want to eat this week, instead of just ordering in and oops, it's lunchtime, what's in the break room and whatever. And I've always thought about that because it's like that's where people are like, I cut out dairy and I feel so much better. And it's like, is it the dairy, or is it for the first time you're really thinking about how you feel when you eat and noticing things?
Yes, and I think that, and I suppose that's where, sometimes the kind of key message that so many wellness influencers, I suppose, share, which is that we kind of live in quite unhealthy society, can resonate.
Yeah.
But I remember kind of after the pandemic just being really quite isolated and, cutting out so many food groups from my diet. And then just one day I just got tired of it. Essentially, it just didn't help. For 2 years, I tried everything. And one day I was like, I'm just going to stop and I'm just going to take my treatment. And I kind of gave up on the kind of food, I suppose, kind of elimination. But then I started taking more regular walks. I did start swimming in the sea and, just taking more time to do these quite basic things. And that's
Yeah.
when I started seeing improvements. And I, for the record, I think diet is completely, like, it's so important to people's general well being. But I think that essentially you can sometimes forget that you've had unhealthy lifestyles for many other reasons, because you were alone, because you didn't see your friends, because actually maybe you didn't get that fresh air. And it just sounds so basic to say, but then if you've got an office job and you're working long hours like I was, I suppose, kind of doing, social media investigations for hours a day, with kind of alternative social media accounts feeding me kind of dark stuff and not really having time for a walk. Then suddenly you just do quite basic lifestyle changes and you see massive improvement. And you can just forget that in some ways, kind of well being can be incredibly simple. You can
Hmm.
feel quite good. I'm not saying perfect, but you can feel quite good having an, in my case, for instance, quite an omnivorous diet and taking a daily walk and, just reading a book like that has made a massive difference to my life. And clearly I wasn't doing that enough.
Yeah.
But I remember the time when I thought that if I gave up nuts, it would sort out everything. Whereas actually, reading more, getting out more sorted me out a lot more. And I think it's really, you can really get very narrow with your vision. Um, and I think that, yes, many people don't actually feel quite bad, I think, because like me, they have office jobs that are really quite demanding, where they just don't have that time and for themselves, that rest. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it's an explanation for everyone's, you know,
Well,
health
I
concerns.
think
But what I'm saying is that sometimes we can really obsessively focus on one thing, especially when it's seeded to us through our social media feed. And then we just forget some very basic things, and that can make a massive difference to us. And I think that actually, once you start disconnecting a little bit from, and that goes back to a point I was making earlier, which is once you stop thinking about everything as either promoting or destroying your health, you can actually do quite healthy things, regardless of whether they are that healthy. Like you were mentioning the cold plunges. I don't know how healthy they are. I mean, they feel healthy to me. I'm socializing with people when I go and we plunge, and that's great. I don't do it because I have great hope that it will materially, I don't know, improve
right.
my condition or something else, or make me live longer. And I think that once you're able to do that, in some ways you're able to do things that are probably quite healthy, but without that agenda.
Mhm. Mhm. Totally. Uh, totally. I think that that to me is like really the key to health, is that people find their way into um things that are, I like to use the word sometimes, just wholesome, just like wholesome
Mm.
activities, without this like greater agenda. And I do a virtual running club that's very beginners focused, and a big reason that we have that is because there's really not a space for people who are curious about running, but always thought of themselves as uncoordinated, or like that seems really hard. I don't know where to start, or I tried running and I immediately hurt myself. So it's like a very gentle entry point. But I always, um, nudge people to try to sign up for a race somewhere, like, everyone's town has a little 5K or something, and I was like, "It's not what you think, it's not this, it isn't the optimization world there. They're very family friendly, goofy experiences where people often like I just did a race recently and there was a man just dressed as a banana with like
Mhm.
no change of his facial expression, almost like he was like, "Oh, I forgot my running clothes. So I'm wearing this banana costume instead." And you see, varying body types and ages and all this stuff and it's actually just like a really wholesome community experience and it can actually really help you like detach all kinds of story and reasons why you're running now and like help you especially because what we've seen is some of our beginner runners when they start to actually be able to run regularly and consistently they start falling down this trap of shouldn't I be running faster, shouldn't I be running
Mm,
longer, should I track this, should I, and we're like chill, just relax,
mm,
you're having fun, you're getting out there, that was your goal. And yeah, if you want to start like increasing and like really working on your technique we can do that, but not from this, like, have to, should, and that whole, constant bombardment that we get anytime we engage with our bodies. Um, this feels like a good segue. Eh this is not as much my expertise, mainly because I avoid this kind of content, but I read a lot of other people who write about this, and actually my partner is going to school for women and gender studies, so he reads about this a lot, but the whole manosphere world and kind of like this is where patriarchy harms men and this kind of the lone wolf man. My image of these men, and it's also at least in the US, it's come out of the tech bro culture as well. I remember a little while ago, some tech mogul had developed like this gray sludge that you could eat all day instead of having to stop
mm.
for meals so that you were more efficient working. And I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely my goal to slave away in front of my computer more and never look away from a screen to just have a nice, meal that I've made myself. Um, can you speak a little bit about your research into men's wellness and health?
Yeah, so I actually interestingly, I think that men's body dysmorphia and men's health anxieties potentially are the kind of thing that we talk about a lot less, strangely. So, we talk about kind of misogynistic kind of influences like Andrew Tate. We talk about, just kind of more mainstream figures like Jordan Peterson. We talk a lot less about wellness content directed at men, unless you're kind of immersed in that world. And I think that that's one kind of, I suppose, slightly newer entry point for men. I mean, obviously, a lot of manosphere influencers will sell you a mix of kind of fitness, crypto, and, kind of vaguely kind of political message. But I actually also think that now you've got this really kind of incredibly kind of growing content that essentially tells men that the chemicals are kind of emasculating them, that their sperm count is low, which by the way, like it's getting lower objectively. There are studies on that. And really kind of weaponizing potential fears about masculinity and, maybe genuine also kind of health concerns. And so I think the same thing that's happening with women and kind of when we think about the pill, it's also kind of happening to men, where I think many men might feel actually they're not feeling that great. They are spending long hours in the office. They don't feel great. And then they see this manosphere influencers saying, well, if you hit the gym, you'll feel great. And then you might hit the gym and feel great. But quite often, what essentially the entry point or that message will reach you through someone who will tell you that actually society is designed to weaken you if you're a man, that society and you should go against the mainstream because the mainstream wants you weak and all of that. And that message really comes from the manosphere. And I think that there are, of course, then a lot of norms associated with strength and a lot of kind of expectations. And as soon as, say, if you're a man and you go to the gym and you feel a lot better genuinely, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with the gym. There's even
Right.
nothing wrong with getting muscle. But of course, it's quite often tied with increasingly unrealistic expectations of what male bodies should look like, which isn't new. I mean, gym culture has been around for a while, but what I think is really interesting is how it has really changed in the last few years. So, when you think about, the kind of Marvel comics and the kind of
Totally.
Superman and all of that, I mean, Superman was Superman when he was created because he wasn't meant to be a realistic representation of the male body. But now you go to the gym, I mean, I don't know, every second guy looks like Superman. In
Yeah,
terms of like the kind of expectation of muscles, I think you do get increasingly kind of, I mean, there is such, I do think that body dysmorphia among men is on the rise. I mean, there are studies showing that. I think that the kind of accessibility of, well, I think popular culture, and I also think that the kind of mainstreaming of gym culture means that men feel under a lot more pressure to also, I suppose, be fit. And then you've got these people telling them that, actually society wants them weak and they can regain power by going to the gym and taking control of their life and taking control of their women as well while we're at it. But, you know, taking some control over your life might not be, I think everyone wants a sense of control. Um, but I suppose control for what? And what's really absent from all this wellness content directed at men is any sense of men's contribution to the greater good. There's never any kind of notion that, yes, you might go to the gym and feel better. And can you be a better man? Is there something you bring to your community? It's about you optimizing yourself in a society that doesn't have your best interest at heart. And that's obviously the message of the manosphere. It's that, in today's society, men are discriminated against, that, they can't be men anymore. And that if they optimize themselves enough and, go to the gym and invest in crypto, they can just, create their own little world where they will have control. But there's never any notion of kind of creating better men. I do think that there are obviously organizations, there are people trying to do something different. And for my book, for instance, I've interviewed a lot of organizations that work with men. And, it's a tricky one because quite often a lot of men working with men will say things like, well, men don't hang out anymore. They spend their day on their phone, that they don't, get out. And they, I think quite often the gym is kind of presented as an antidote to a lot of these things. And it's, if men exercised more, they would feel a lot kind of better. And I think there's a truth to it, is how can you make essentially fitness and wellness, so that applies to both men and women. How can you make fitness and wellness, something that is good for you, but that also makes you a better person, that actually helps you have an impact? I think the way I think of my own engagement in wellness, whether it's cold swimming, whether it's something else, is like, how much energy do I want to give to that? And what does it help me do? And I
mm,
think that wellness serves me if it helps me be well enough to actually be able to work and have some sort of kind of political, social impact. Otherwise, if it's just about me optimizing myself, for me, it's not worth it particularly. It's not. I know that health is fantastic if you can have it, but it's also, you can't control everything in your life. I can't guarantee my health. I can do my best, but I could also spend every second of every day trying to do more for my health. And I've got to draw a line somewhere. And I think that when it comes to kind of men, and the kind of manosphere content, I just really see an absence of just any kind of, as I said, idea that men could contribute something
mm, mm.
other than, just optimizing themselves.
That's brilliant, and that actually really is ties in with your point about the Marvel content comics, because that is always the lone, superhero against the world. He's definitely not depicted as like a community leader or a family man or, helping his friends move or something. He's always just alone in his, secret hideaway or whatever. Um, that is really brilliant, and definitely made I love watching, like, vintage, TV, like, 70s and 80s TV shows, and the men at that time, it's so recent, and they all have little skinny arms, and they're very slim and, essentially weak looking. It does not look like, you watch the first Star Trek series, those men don't look like they do very many push-ups or anything, you know? They don't have pecs, they don't they're just very average looking, and then fast forward to where we are now, and
Yeah.
you wouldn't see a man on TV who's not, rippling in some way. So it is very recent, the way that men's bodies have been depicted. Um, the last point I wanna ask you about is it's something that's very key to your work, and I think, like, I'm almost embarrassed is, like, in a way, it's, like, still really hard for me to I think because it will make me, like, crushingly, hopeless, is that there's real intentionality around some of this wellness, influence like, the real misinformation that is harming people. There is political agenda that's very intentional. It's not accidental. It's not just a Venn diagram of people that are interested in making their own sourdough. Turns out they're also interested in, like, heteronormative gender roles. It's very much on purpose to get people who are interested in making their own sourdough to fall down a hole where they end up saying, I guess I should give up my career and live at home and have a bunch more babies and give up all of my rights around my body. Can you speak a little bit um, about that really insidious, that there really are political forces putting effort behind these wellness trends?
Yeah, so I think I suppose the issue is that in some ways political extremes have become incredibly kind of mainstream, and wellness content is mainstream as well. So for me, what I find kind of really interesting from a purely from the point of view of my own experience online is that I find that so much content, and it's probably determined by what I'm interested in, but there's just so much wellness, fitness, food content on social media, just in general. And then at the same time, you know, things that used to be really confined to very fringe blogs and forums are now everywhere. So tradwife content 10 years ago used to be one Reddit group. Now it's just countless influencers. And essentially, some of them are quite innocuous, some of them are really quite strongly kind of political. And it all blends with the fact that some of the things they talk about with a very clear agenda is also seemingly kind of depoliticized as well. So when you think about tradwives and how tradwives just talk about drinking raw milk because it's pure, it's this return to whatever, it just makes women more kind of fertile and it's pure food. It's this idea of purity, right? And at the same time, I think things like that just turn into a mainstream wellness trend, right? In parts of, in certain kind of communities. And in some ways now, every crazy idea or every kind of fad that has, I guess, originated in these more political communities becomes a mainstream topic of discussion. So some far right influencers become obsessed with carnivore. Suddenly you've got articles in mainstream media saying, is the carnivore diet really good for you? Or is it crazy? And asking a nutritionist who will say, no, don't do it. But do you know what I mean? In a way,
Yeah.
the mainstream sphere just kind of catches up with things that actually originate from quite politicized communities. And food has always been political, I think it's not neutral. Kind of food has meaning and it can be political. But I do think that what these political communities have done quite well is also exploit this general feeling of confusion that we have. Confusion around um, medical recommendations. As I said, you can Google what's a healthy diet. People will say it's, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, whatever, oily fish and things. But I think in many ways, many people don't believe that because indeed, as we've discussed, well, whole grains unhealthy because, hey, I'm giving up gluten. So I think it's incredibly kind of difficult to relate to these kind of medical recommendations. Um, but they have really kind of exploited that kind of feeling. All that stuff is incredibly popular in these kind of tradwife communities. And it doesn't have to be right wing, we kind of do these cold plunges. But in some ways, there's a risk that some things that aren't inherently political can be politicized. And, there is this idea that I also see a lot of men kind of retreats for men, slightly kind of manosphere adjacent, showing men plunging into kind of cold
Hmm.
pools because they're so strong and, they're kind of playing into these Nordic tropes. And there's just nothing wrong with the cold plunge, but it's just who kind of dominates the conversation and who. I mean, are we going to think that cold plunges are a right wing thing or not? I
Right.
don't think we should think of it as that way. But if something becomes associated with a specific community, whether it's I'm not in favor of raw milk, but say if raw milk is associated with kind of tradwife communities and kind of the manosphere, then we think of it as something that's kind of inherently kind of conservative or,
Yeah.
and I think that's just one example. But it just means that essentially, I think that certain kind of communities and end up owning wellness a little bit. Or
Hmm.
do you know what I mean? Because
Absolutely.
wellness is shifted to the right, there is this risk that people who are online, who are trying to do wellness, who are trying to talk about nutrition, who are trying to talk about fitness in ways that are inclusive and who are, you know, trying to do that offering might be a bit drowned by just people who are using fitness, wellness, food as symbols or as kind of, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the conversation around purity, I mean, it's a very old fascist line of thinking, the kind of ultimate body, literally to the point of putting disabled people into concentration camps. So this idea of like this like ultra fit body being the best body, which also happens to be a white body, if anything, a northern white body, that's been around for far too long already, and it's very easy to um, turn that into like a real uh, kind of landing strip for people to get radicalized to the right. And it's also interesting, you made me think about how um, raw milk and kind of pure back to nature food actually used to be very, very left wing. It was like the hippies with the bare feet and who had turned away from mainstream culture in a different way. And now it's being seen as this ultra right wing thing. And this is how these different political places can start to own, sadly, the very things that we need just to live, which then again makes everyone very confused because they're like, now is eating vegetables a right wing thing. And I don't want to be right wing. And I've seen that in my field, in kind of people that have loud voices in my field, almost pushing back on just the basics of what a human body needs to be alive, because they see any kind of intentionality around fitness and around eating in a like a healthful way, or I'd prefer to say like a wholesome way, as a kind of repression or restriction, or coming from like these white women with big blue eyes who are standing around with 18 kids and their goats or whatever, secretly saying all women should give up birth control and stay home. And that is so disturbing to me, because I'm like, when these groups get really loud, we literally almost, if you're like a shill if you eat a salad, because now now that's aligned with this trad wife thing, as opposed to being like, also vegetables are good for you. Like.
Yeah, I think it's a thing that I have because I suppose that I'm thinking along the same lines because, as I said, I think I'm a conservative eater. I'm someone who exercises. I'm not in any ways, I don't think, extreme, but I would probably, if you ask, I don't know, a few of my friends, people would probably say that I'm quite health conscious and that,
Right.
I'm into wellness, if you want to use that expression. And I always think, is this me really having some sort of internalized kind of norms. And it so happens that my mother was quite conservative, and I had a lot of messages as a teen around being slim. And so my family has a big kind of like fat phobia runs in the
Sure.
family. And so when I engage with kind of wellness in general, even things that, just cooking from scratch, I always think, well, deep down, am I being, I don't know, am I actually quite kind of right wing in my thinking, or am I kind of falling for these kind of norms of kind of slimness at a time when, everyone's talking about skinny talk? Am I, in some
Mhm,
ways, am I
mhm.
playing into this? And maybe a little bit. I mean, I was brought up, as I said, with, a lot of kind of fat phobia. I probably do have some internalized fat phobia, which is really unfortunate. And I'm kind of probably working to undo some of that in myself. But I think, as you said, there is this danger that potentially we think about just talking about how, like, in a way that we think of talking about health or fitness as something that's inherently kind of shaming or that is repressive, as you said. Um, it's hard. It's a hard balance to strike. I think the way that I think about it is that as soon as you put some, I suppose, kind of community or kind of collective thinking into improving access to fitness or,
Mhm.
food systems, I think you just turn that into something that actually just has a bigger kind of impact for everyone. So for me, these days, I'm a lot less interested in whether my diet is perfect and whether I avoid many ultra processed foods. And I'm much more interested in how we actually make sure that we can have access to better, fresher produce that's kind of cheaper. I'm a lot more interested in thinking about that. Um, Similarly, I'm a lot more interested in how you can make exercise available or, green space available for everyone. And of course, I'm not, someone who's actually designing the public policy. So it's not like I can influence that. But in very simple and small ways, I tried to bring that collective thinking into the mix. So I can maybe share one example, but you were mentioning some of your own experiences. I actually I'm part of a local cooking club where I'm from, and it's a cooking club for 7 to 11-year-olds. And essentially, it's with a friend of mine who's a chef, and he runs it with his wife. And the kids just cook a meal from scratch, like three-course meal, and then the parents come at
Huh.
whatever, six or
So
seven, and
cute.
they eat. And there is just this kind of it's fresh food. They learn how to cook, but it doesn't have the agenda of being like, oh, now we're going to learn that this is a carb or that this is what you need to make it balanced. It's just for the joy of cooking and people kind of eating together. And something like that for me, I cannot do that and kind of think about whether things are healthy or not because it's just great as it is in some ways. Um So I don't know, maybe that's kind of a bit of a digression, but
Not at all. I actually think that's a wonderful place to finish. I mean, that's so beautiful, and I think that speaks to so many things that we're talking about. It's community, it's simple, it's like undeniably healthy, right? Like how can anyone say that people coming
yeah.
together, children coming together, families, sharing food that, at the core of what food is, it's an experience and it's something that it marks time for us, it creates ritual, it's a place to connect with people, um, and that's such a wonderful space that's there, and we can only hope that more spaces like that. There's always backlashes to backlashes, so as more and more superhero men emerge, there will be more and more children's cooking clubs to push back on that.
I do think so. I think I do have some hope actually. I think there is definitely a reaction to the most kind of extreme diet and wellness content, despite
Mhm.
the fact that, as you said, we're in the kind of Ozempic era, despite all the kind of skinny content on social media. I also think there is a real reaction to it, and that I think we've come a certain way, and I just don't think we're going back fully to
Same.
the worst of the diet culture. a few
Yeah.
decades ago.
I agree. Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I'm excited to read your book and hopefully have you back sometime because this is just endless
Oh
sidebars
yeah,
that
I
we
mean,
could
I
go
think
on.
3 hours of this.
I'm Cadence Debuse. That was Busybody Podcast. I'm the founder and owner of Brooklyn Strength Studios. You can find me on Instagram at Brooklyn Strength. You can find out more about my offerings on my website, brooklynstrength.com. I hope you'll subscribe to my Substack, After Class. All's in the show notes. Please rate, review, and subscribe. Please share with your friends so that more people listen to this podcast. I love these conversations, and I hope more people can hear them. My music is by Rob Byrne, performed by the Wild Yaks. My podcast is produced by Brad at Train Sound Studios, and my illustrations are by Jackie Mendez and Azul Trejo, and edited by myself. Thank you so much.